Hello, everybody. Welcome to Rack's home here at the Little Washington Theater. And I want to tell you that of all the fantastic things that Rack does every year, this is my very favorite. And it is such a pleasure and privilege to work with co-directors Lynn and Ed Dolnick and Dick Raines. They are great at scouting out potential storytellers. So that's our first job, and then it is so much fun to coach the people who step forward in deciding what story they really want to tell, shaping it, and bringing it to the stage to share with all of you. So many of you know that Joyce Abel and Julie Portman launched No Ordinary Person 27 years ago. Yeah. Joyce and I and Jean Elizabeth were the first round of storytellers, and Joyce really coached and developed this program in the decades afterwards. So you'll hear more about her today. But the next phase is kind of thinking about what stories are all about. So I guarantee that nobody in this audience will have had the exact same experiences that you're going to hear about today. And you may be glad of that. But as all good stories do, rich in their unique details, they often touch something in the listener that touches their experience or their imagination, whether that's fear or joy or surprise, something that resonates. So the stories you're going to hear tonight come from Jane Kuhn, Chris Dockson, Caroline Anstey, and Barney O'Meara, in that order. One explanatory note I want to offer is, owing to a hoarse voice, Jane has asked that her granddaughter, Lakota, read her story for her. Now, Lakota is not only Jane's granddaughter, but she's a veteran of the Rack stage, so it was a great choice. But it is Jane's story. So Jane is going to be up here listening with all of us, and I feel like it's kind of looking back at her 20-something self and reliving the experience from back then. So it's a little change up, but I think very special to have Jane do that. So after Barney's story, he's the last in our lineup, we are going to invite you to stay, if you would like, for a brief 15-minute audience talkback that Dick Raines is going to moderate. And that gives you a chance to ask questions about the stories, about the process, et cetera. And of course, we always hope that some of you listening to these folks will decide you might want to tell a story next year or sometime in the future. So keep that in mind. Thank you all so much for coming. And now, as always, we tell you it's time to do your part, which is to listen to, receive, and celebrate these wonderful stories. Thank you. That's all right.
It was the season for roses in Peshawar. At the old Peshawar Club where I stayed, gardeners cultivated English varieties, transplanted long ago by the British to this frontier town at the foot of the Khyber Pass. Next door, in the military cantonment, platoons of carefully pruned roses, pinks, yellows, whites, marched upright in disciplined rows. Native climbing roses, thorny and untamed, clambered over the compound walls outside. And in the old city of Peshawar, second and third story window boxes full of roses teetered alarmingly, over the crowded, narrow streets, the fragrance deliciously mixed with dust, spices, and dung. The roses were an unexpected bonus on my first visit, now over 60 years ago, to Peshawar and Pakistan's storied northwest frontier. I was young and wide-eyed, living in Karachi, my first Foreign Service post. Pakistan provided a whole world to be explored, a world I'd read about and now could see and hear and smell. This was Kipling country, and Kim had been my Harry Potter. Here in a Peshawar caravanserai, Mahbub Ali, the wily horse trader, entrusted Kim with secret letters revealing the plots of Central Asian emirs. When Kipling wrote his stories of India, British troops were trying to keep the peace among the Pushtun tribes on this lawless frontier with Afghanistan. But now, a decade after the end of the British Raj, the northwest frontier under Pakistan's rule was fairly quiet. The Afghan king ruled peacefully in Kabul. The Soviets remained safely north of the Amu Darya River. American troops had no Taliban to chase. And Peshawar was awash in roses. Naturally, abrim with curiosity, I promptly set out to explore the old city in a local taxi, an open, two-wheeled, horse-drawn vehicle called a tonga. The horse wore a garland of roses. I sat facing the rear, back to back with the driver as we trotted off to the Peshawar Bazaar. Laden donkeys, honking lorries, supercilious camels, pushcarts, bicycles, bleating goats, fat-tailed sheep, and men, some carrying rifles, all jammed the narrow streets, bringing my tonga to a halt in one twisting alley. I watched a barber a few feet away, squatting on the pavement with a client, an aquiline, sinewy Pushtun tribesman. His long gray shirt hung over baggy pants, hitched up to reveal splayed, calloused feet shod in thick, rubber-soled sandals made from old truck tires. A bandolier crisscrossed his chest. A hand-tooled rifle leaned on the wall behind him. Two pink roses peeked out from the folds of a black turban which sat on his knee, while the barber expertly trimmed the hair in one ear. Catching sight of me in the tonga, the tribesman brushed aside the barber with one long arm, unfolded to his full, impressive height, blew his nose one nostril at a time into the street, and stared at me. Unblinking, neither hostile nor friendly, he just stared. Curiosity I was discovering could cut both ways. North of Peshawar lay Swat, a small, semi-autonomous principality which I planned to visit with an English friend from Karachi. Not yet a common tourist destination, Swat mostly attracted a few trekkers or mountaineers. Its hopes of becoming the Switzerland of the East, however, had recently been dampened by the robbery and murder of a young Italian woman trekker and her companion. John and I had checked our map. Her camp had been some miles beyond the lodge where we would stay. Besides, we were day hikers, not serious trekkers, and of course, we enjoyed the immortality of youth. An ancient taxi took us to Swat. With radiator steaming, it coughed its way up the ever-sharper switchbacks of the bleak Malakand Pass that rose steeply from Peshawar Valley like the shaggy, grey, huge brown hump of a camel. No roses here. The pass had been fought over in wars dating back to Alexander. A dun-colored, mud-walled fort seemed to grow naturally out of the barren, rocky terrain. The heights above it were studded with monuments to British regiments which had fought the tribesmen not so long ago. Swat was Pushtun tribal territory, and we had obtained special permits for the trip. At the top of the pass, a policeman waved us to a halt with his old Lee Enfield rifle, checked our papers, and entered our names in a worn ledger. From the guard post, we looked down on Swat, a magical green sliver of valley, hemmed in by mountains on both sides, and blocked at the north end by the massive, snow-capped Karakoram Range. Halfway up the valley on the west bank of the Swat River lay our lodge, almost hidden by a tangle of climbing roses. We were the only guests. Next morning, with cheese and flaps of Afghan bread stuffed into a day pack, we set off for an easy day's hike up the mountain behind the lodge. For an hour or more, we climbed between tiny terraced fields which seemed to creep up toward an ever-receding skyline. Above the terracing, we traversed rocky mountain pastures denuded by grazing sheep and goats. 2 young shepherds stood, stock still, and gaped as we tramped by. The worn path we were on was hollowed out by the bare feet of ragged porters, each bent almost double under a heavy log carrying down the mountain to a sawmill by the river. The source of those logs, a forest still far above us, lured us upward. We kept climbing, but in the mysterious way of mountains, our goal seemed to keep receding up the steep slope above us, slipping around each rise and disappearing over the next ridge line. The unfamiliar altitude had us gasping as we stopped frequently to rest. It was the late afternoon before we admitted defeat and turned to start down. The log carriers we met on our way up had now made their last trip of the day. The sheep and goats had been driven down and tethered safely in their pens. A dozen woodcutters scrambled past us, hurrying down the steep path to their homes in the darkening valley. Now we seemed to be alone, except for 2 tiny figures moving more slowly down the mountain far ahead of us. They carried guns. The sun sets early in the mountains. Far below, already in the shadows, was the dark ribbon of the Swat River. We could just make out our lodge, huddled next to the only road leading up the valley. Across the river, the setting sun briefly highlighted a spidery network of paths linking scattered homesteads. Shadows were already creeping upward in an irregular pattern, inked in by the peaks behind us. The icy Karakoram towered impassively over the northern end of the valley. To the south stood the brooding brown massif of the Malakand Pass we had crossed the day before. As the sun disappeared behind the ridge above us, John and I slowed our pace to let the 2 armed men get well ahead. They disappeared around a bend, reappeared further down the path, but as shadows lengthened, the distance between us and the men seemed to shorten. The men glanced back at us and almost imperceptibly slowed down. We paused, as if tired. They paused. I glanced at John, slight, bespectacled, and a little wimpy in his proper English walking shorts and knee socks. I wondered who the female Italian trekker had been with on her hike. It was clear that we couldn't stay on the mountain after dark. We started down again. The men moved on, but even more slowly. They were roughly dressed tribals, heavily bearded under black turbans. Each carried a long rifle. The men reached a fork in the path and stopped, resting on their guns. To the left, the path descended to our lodge, To the right, it disappeared around a hillock and dropped sharply down into the darkening side valley. There were no other choices. The men stood silent, waiting, watching. One motioned to us. We slowly, hesitantly moved down toward them. They greeted us with a nod and a soft salam alaikum. We responded uncertainly, alaikum assalam. After a pause and a long, curious look, the older tribesman reached up, took a rose from behind his ear, and handed it to me. Then they picked up their guns, turned, and disappeared down the path to the right.
Even a perfect childhood, sooner or later, must come to an end. Little did I know how abrupt that ending would be, nor the survival skills that I would have to utilize. I grew up on the outskirts of Montreal in an international neighborhood. My friends were Corinne Horowitz and Harriet Berman, and I would go to temple with them sometimes. And my best girlfriend was Joanne Porter. Our backyards backed up against each other. Corinne and Harriet would, during Hanukkah, show us all their gifts that they would get over a period of a week, and we were all crazy jealous. And then, of course, Christmas came, and my brother Mike and I hit the mother lode, and they were jealous. But we all played with our toys and just shared, and we had a great time. All the kids in the neighborhood would play on the warm summer nights out in the streets, hide and seek, and were told by all our parents to simply come in when the street lamps went on. And I remember playing a 45 record of the Monkees, Daydream Believer. Remember that song? Daydream Believer, and ad nauseum, to my parents' chagrin, I'm sure. And I had photos of Davy Jones plastered all over my bedroom from 16 magazine. I remember a neighbor, windows wide open, playing Nancy Sinatra's These Boots Are Made for Walking at full blast. The whole neighborhood reverberated. My family, we'd go to the local German deli pretty much once a week, and we would purchase our favorite German delicacies, Blutwurst and Butterkäse and Bierwurst and sausages and all manner of smoked fish, and that would be our Saturday afternoon lunch. My kid brother and I often walked to the local penny candy store, and we would buy our bubblegum baseball cards, if you all remember those, and large squares of honeycomb, Macintosh toffee, Smarties, and caramel bars with our weekly allowance. And I spent summers and weekends and holidays with my grandparents, my Oma Eva and my Opa Martin, and they lived in Morin Heights in the Laurentian Mountains, an hour outside of Montreal. And it is Montreal's Rappahannock. Swathed in soft, swollen hills, pastures and woodlands, the landscape was all about skiing, swimming, hiking, and so much more. I remember Cat Stevens had a recording studio just several miles from my grandparents' home. My Opa would take me on daily walks exploring the countryside and visiting neighbors. We'd stroll for miles, his hand-carved cane tightly clasped in his hand, and I actually still have it to this day. He'd take me to the Alpino, a small-scale, popular ski resort on Jackson Road, with a casual restaurant and bar just above the Alpino Lake where we'd go swimming in the summer. On our long leisurely walks throughout the Morin Heights countryside, he'd point out beaver dams and pick up delicate salamanders in his hands and hold them, and he would show me their tiny, slick, long-tailed bodies and reveal the bear's den to me in the deep of the winter with all the snow we used to get back then. Hibernating, warm breaths coming up like steam through the snow. It was amazing. Most every day we'd play gin rummy, and I'll tell you, he was a maestro for hours. And my Oma Ava would join us at the table, and she would play solitaire and smoke her cameo menthols. And in later years, I would occasionally steal one or two and hide back in the back of the house under the pine trees on a bed of pine needles and quietly puff away. On the way to Morin Heights, we'd always stop at a bakery close by, and we would buy a Brötchen, which is a German, basically a national pastime, if you will. It's just wonderful. They're bread rolls, very crispy on the outside and soft and chewy on the inside. And the smell was intoxicating in our little Volkswagen, and they were still warm by the time we got to my grandparents, and we'd hustle into the house and make our lunch for the weekend on a Saturday. But this cozy world changed quite dramatically. It was 1967, the year of Expo in Montreal. Some of you may remember that. It was a violent time when the French majority sought to separate Quebec from Canada. And many companies pulled up stakes and moved to other provinces, mostly to Ontario. Whole neighborhoods were up for sale. For miles, all you could see were for sale signs. Bombings were frequent. A cabinet minister under Pierre Trudeau, whose son Justin now is the premier of Canada. He was kidnapped, allegedly held in Morin Heights, where my grandparents lived, and then he was killed. And a new premier was elected in Quebec. His name was René Lévesque. He was French-Canadian, and he was about to pass a Bill 101, which would have effectively forced kids like me and my brother, English-speaking kids and from English-speaking communities, to go to French-speaking schools. And my parents decided to move, and we moved to Massachusetts. And my perfect childhood came to an abrupt end. We found ourselves in a tight-knit New England community, we a tiny German family, in the midst of Irish Catholics and Italian Americans, families with hundreds of years of New England pedigree, sporting uber large families, and a deep resonant history with New England. We stood out, we spoke differently, we ate differently, we even dressed differently a bit. And my brother Mike and I were bullied. And he was beaten up most every day to and from the Herald School, our elementary school, mostly by a big boy named Tommy. He was brutish. And I still remember his hands were so large. It was really intimidating. I had no friends except for Donna. She was obese, and she had no friends. And she lived in Keltown, a neighborhood of compact, closely planted homes, a village of sorts. And her parents were also obese, and they were very kind to me. I cried every day coming home from school, telling my mom I didn't want to speak like these people. They had no R's in their alphabet. A car was a car. A cellar was a cella. Our town of Woburn was Woburn. Pissa meant awesome. Wicked, pissa meant that was fabulous. I breezed through classes, so ahead was I, academically, and I stood out differently in a lot of ways. I curtsied to my fourth grade teacher upon being introduced to her in the new class, and was, made fun of. My mom was a wonderful seamstress, and she made me beautiful clothes, everything from coats to dresses to everything. And I would wear some to school, which made me stand out even more. And the bullying continued relentlessly. Sometimes after school, word would get out that kids wanted to follow me down the wooded path from the school to Sheridan Street to beat me up. And I remember asking one of my teachers if I could leave early so I could avoid, getting hurt. And he was so saddened and furious that that could really happen. Junior high was often turbulent. Walking to school daily to the Joyce Junior High was only a mile and a half. A cluster of neighborhood kids would walk together, and I'd be kind of excluded walking alongside. No one really wanted to play with me, and my parents thought seriously about moving. And it was my first time experiencing depression. I was 12. And I wanted to be one of my gerbils. Simply living in a cage atop my pretty white bedroom dresser, in a glass-enclosed hutch with gerbil food, and no thoughts of anxiety or wanting to fit in. But I decided I wasn't going to live in a cage, and high school became my breakout. It became my game changer. I found myself in a class of over 750 kids, my class alone. And it was big, but somehow I could navigate. And I found my bearings, and I broke out of my cage, and I learned to please people, basically to gain their approval and have them like me. And I made it my mission to become the most popular girl in high school. It was a mission, a real serious mission. And I embraced everyone, the cool popular cliques and the kids who were not part of the cool scene. I was especially accepted by them because I think they knew intuitively that I was genuine and I wanted to be their friends, and I wasn't donning a cooler than thou, kind of facade. During junior high, I hung out with the Thornton Street gang, which really wasn't a gang, just a bunch of kids hanging out on Thornton and Burlington Street. Remember, it was the 70s, it was a safe time. And then in high school, I hung out with the kids at Central Square, and they were wildly cool. I nested there and made good friends. We smoked cigarettes and pot and drank beer and took the occasional mescaline and went to great rock concerts at the Boston Garden. And we'd take trips to New Hampshire and Vermont and Maine, and we would, especially in the wintertime, rent out chalets, literally 10-bedroom size chalets. And the boys, a lot of them worked for the local railroad, and they had the money to do that. And we just had a total blast, and we partied hard. My folks loved to have my friends over. My dad, Hans, was a wine connoisseur, and the legal age then was 18, though I suspect he would have introduced wines and liqueurs to these kids even if they were 15. He just loved it. And my mom, Anna Laura, was a phenomenal cook, and she would make these kids beef bourguignon and beef Wellington, and kids loved coming to Chris's on Cassidy Drive. So I guess it worked, maybe better than I hoped. By the time I was to graduate from high school, I was voted most popular and most friendly for my yearbook. The principal, known fondly as Dogger, because he doggedly chased the kids all throughout the school grounds, catching us skipping classes and, drinking beer out of somebody's Mustang, came to me and said I could only have one. And since I knew Kathy, the head of the cheerleading squad for a football team, really wanted to be chosen most popular, I relinquished that honor. And to this day, she actually doesn't know that I did that. I couldn't stop wanting to please. I would have preferred the most popular, however, because handsome Johnny Allen, whom I fell in love with in the 4th grade, and who was my best male friend all through school, a winning quarterback who, along with Kevin and Gio and Eric, brought us to the state championships, was chosen most popular. I would have liked to have been pictured side by side with him in the yearbook. And my need to please sometimes went to ridiculous lengths. I acknowledged somebody as a best friend in my yearbook where you have a passage that you write about, your 4 years of experience, who actually wasn't my best friend. In fact, she was one of my earliest bullies. Perhaps I suffered from a non-hostage taking version of Stockholm Syndrome, if you will, where a captive cements this bond, a victim's desire to survive trumps the urge to hate the person who actually created the situation. My best friends were actually Nancy and Mary, and I never even acknowledged them. Even to this day, I try to please. Many of you here in the audience are part of my ladies' lunch bunch. I adore all of you. You know how much I want to please you and be popular. But today, unlike in my high school yearbook, you really are all my wonderful friends, genuine friends. There are no more gerbil cages to want to be in. No more Stockholm Syndrome. And my perfect childhood has become my perfect adult life. Wally, my handsome partner for life, enjoy our country kitchen, sitting at our butcher block, heavy wood hewn table upon towering wooden chairs, the three great Pyrenees, many you all know, Shutzy and Bear Bear and Wallace, our newest, stretched out with legs splayed, taking up every inch of the kitchen. We enjoy a wood fire in the cold months, savoring our beautiful 125-year-old farmhouse. Tucked away in the woods, the horses and chickens and rabbits, and our brand new fainting goats, all of which are only inches, maybe feet from our doors. And Wally and I play rummy frequently. And I'm reminded of my childhood in Quebec and my Gola.
So the first thing I'm going to do is ask anybody who's right at the back if they could wave if they don't hear me, because it's important that you hear. I'm going to be speaking in English and there will be no subtitles. It all began with a chair. It was 1964. I was 9. I loved to sit at the dining table and tip my chair backwards so the back rested on the wall behind and the two legs and my two legs dangled in midair. Don't tip your chair backwards like that. It's dangerous. Not only that, it's unladylike, my mother said for the 100th time. And when neither of those admonishments elicited the response she wanted, she used her own personal coup de grace. If you were dining at Buckingham Palace, you would embarrass both yourself and us. Some children were threatened with being put to bed with no supper. For my mother, it was always the palace. It's hard if you're not English and have only grown up with royalty as spectacle. Weddings, funerals, coronations, and yes, we do them all so well. It's hard to appreciate the warp and the weft of royal family in English life. A constitutional monarchy with no real make or break power, though students of the royal prerogative might disagree, they still exert considerable cultural and social sway. We pray for them. Sometimes we even pray to them. We sing to them. We see them every day on our banknotes and our stamps. We celebrate film premieres with them. We mark their birthdays and all sorts of anniversaries, sometimes even with days off school. And the lucky few, as my parents were, go off each summer sporting morning coats and top hats to Buckingham Palace garden parties. I love to watch my parents dress up, such glamour and glitz, even an envy-provoking night to see the Beatles at the Royal Variety performance in 1963. Well, that's really not fair, is it? What kind of world is it where Beatles concerts are wasted on parents? Not one for little girls who tip their chairs, was my mother's solemn message. Fast forward a few years, and my father won an honor in the annual New Year's Honors List, for which we all trooped off to the palace to watch him bow and walk backwards. Walk backwards? Because, of course, no back can be turned on the sovereign, a practice that has long since been abandoned for fear someone might fall down and sue the crown. At an age when fathers are destined only to embarrass teenage daughters, I'm sure some of you have been there, I was certain he would mess up, and close my eyes, kept my fingers crossed until his backward procession was over. It would have been a grand day out, but my mother insisted I wear a hat. Not a small, discreet hat, what's now called a fascinator, with a feather that gently wafts in the breeze, but a great big, wide-brimmed monstrosity with a sewn-in scarf that tied in the most enormous bow under my chin. I was promised Mary Quant, the fashion goddess of Carnaby Street. Sadly, I emerged more Mary had a little lamb. It was all ghastly. There were other royal indignities inflicted on my young and impressionable self. My father's daily efforts to cure me of my glottal stop, perfected at an age when it seemed so much cooler to talk with a Cockney accent rather than master the Queen's English. Queen's English, there are those royals again. But my father worried that anything less than the Queen's English, his English, would tarnish my future forever. For those who have never had to endure daily lectures on the glottal stop, I will endeavor to explain. A good glottal stop must move to the back of the mouth and cut off the word before it is completed. So give us the butter would morph into give the butter. I loved my glottal stops and believed I was representing new man or new woman in a whole cool new Britannia, where how you spoke would cease to matter. After all, this was the 1960s. The royals might still be on the throne, but change was in the air. My brother rebelled by growing his hair down to his shoulders. My rebellion was my glottal stop. And then came the final royal straw. Off on a family jolly to Simpson's in the Strand, famed for its Sunday lunch of roast beef carved at the table and Yorkshire pudding, sporting my very new and very chic black velvet bell-bottoms, only to be turned away at the door because young miss is wearing trousers. As the head steward explained to my increasingly deflated father as he watched all hope of his Sunday roast slipping away. We follow the palace, sir. Skirts and dresses only for women. This royal family was everywhere. And so it was for me. The royal family was not just a distant abstraction. The royals were shorthand for all that class malarkey that so dominates English life. All that, but that kind of thing just isn't done, Caroline. All those rules and regulations, all those, what does her father do? as I brought a friend home from school. All that, it's lavatory, never toilet, sitting room, never lounge, napkin, never serviette, pudding, never dessert. It was all an unwelcome intrusion, a snobbish holdover, an ancient artifact designed to pigeonhole and exclude. And worse than that, it was a hard taskmaster, determining how one sat at table, how one spoke, and what one wore, even marring good parent-child relations. It was all the most awful bunkum, and I hated it. Fast forward to 2011. By now, I have lived outside England for 20 years. The royals have ceased to exist as a Damocletian sword held over my head in the cause of better behavior. Indeed, they rarely exist for me at all, save for American television's obsessive coverage of their funerals or weddings, which I try to avoid. Hard to do, but I have abandoned my glottal stop and taken up a mid-Atlantic accent, neither English or American, with its own particular vocabulary. Faucets, yes. Tomatoes, never. Gas stations, yes, but also boots, but always boots and bonnets, never hoods and trunks. Indeed, confused London cabbies invariably ask, which part of the States am I from? So imagine my surprise when I get a call from a headhunter asking if I might want to throw my hat in the ring for the job of Principal Private Secretary to His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales. Surely a mistake, I think. But no, it turns out they want someone different from the usual run of former diplomatic corps or military men. More astonishingly, they tell me that because the salary is capped, since it comes out of the public purse, also known as the hard-pressed British taxpayer, who quite rightly has qualms about supporting too lavish a royal lifestyle, they will throw in a grace and favor apart. Grace and favor, a fancy English way of saying highly subsidized accommodation. With an apartment, in this case, at Kensington Palace. For those unfamiliar with the expansive collection of royal abodes, Kensington Palace is a cross between the Washington School and rather grandiose dorm living for all sorts of minor and some rather more major royals and their children and their dogs, rarely prioritized, I should add, in that order. What, you ask, as I did, is a Principal Private Secretary, or PPS in the royal patois. The PPS is the right-hand man, or perhaps now, for the first time ever, right-hand woman, to the prince. His representative and spokesman, his negotiator with the other royal courts, his observer of the overseer of the prince's finances, his orchestrator of the calendar and the press office and all things princely, and some things less princely, which I will come to in a moment. After a heart-to-heart with my American husband and a lot of his muttering about his probably having to buy new suits, I tell the headhunter to include my name, to the complete astonishment of my American-raised and Republican, small r, sons, who think their mother has been watching far too much Masterpiece Theatre. And so it was that 4 weeks later, I find myself traversing royal corridors en route to my interview with a committee of the good and the great. The Lord Chamberlain, a former advisor to Charles, 2 distinguished members of the House of Lords, an academic and a retired senior member of the royal household. Buckingham Palace. Picture the scene. All is red, a red labyrinth, red carpet, red curtains, red furniture, bordered everywhere with gold. Chic bordello. Not unlike the dining room at the inn at Little Washington. Though in the palace's case, closer inspection reveals it's rather more shabby bordello than chic. And discreetly positioned by doors leading out to the courtyard, twin sets of dog bowls, raised an inch off the ground on, yes, you guessed it, a red platform, lest anyone forget this is home as well to the royal corgis. And everywhere, braid. Braid on the chairs, braid on the equerries, braid on the household cavalry. Ah, the household cavalry. All tight blue trousers with a red stripe, tucked into chained leather boots. Eye candy of the most royal and the most military variety. As you can see, that left an impression. I am wearing Burberry, good English woman that I am, a coat and a smart wool suit with trousers, again with the trousers. Only later do I learn that only skirts or dresses can be worn by female members of His Royal Highness in his household. Over 40 years since the debacle at Simpson's in the Strand, and palace rules are still holding fast. I am seated at a beautiful mahogany table, a bottle of Hilton water to my left, Bath Oliver biscuits on a silver salver to my right, staples in every guest room in every stately home in the kingdom. My interviewers are alternately probing, indulgent, full of courtly warmth. But with courtly warmth, one is never quite sure what is courtly and what is warmth. They emphasize the need to always give sound advice, to be supportive of the prince, but also loyal to the Constitution, not always an easy balance to strike. We talk of foreign policy, of the crown and the Commonwealth, of helping support this prince and heir to the throne as he navigates a more modern and diverse Britain. So far, so good. I am starting to feel excited. But what's this? As the interview progresses, it becomes increasingly clear that what is actually preoccupying the committee is not policy. It's not the delicate exercise of constitutional powers, not those issues that just set my heart racing, but the task of managing the prince's household. All the major royals have a household. The Queen, of course, at that time, had household numero uno, and she has her own PPS, head honcho of all PPSs. The Prince of Wales had a household, and also William and Harry, who start life bundled into their father's household, then set up a separate joint household, and eventually set up fiercely competing households. Each PPS liaises with the others with a clear pecking order, but the rivalries are legendary across households and across the royals who lead them. Think York and Lancaster, and white and red roses. And in the struggle for royal power, not much has changed in 600 years. Royal households aren't always problematic, but this was 2011, a time when this household, the Prince of Wales's household, had been leaking like a sieve. Nannies writing memoirs, valets selling off royal gifts, protection officers revealing perfumed poems from princesses. Despite NDAs and other admonishments, the salacious stories kept pouring forth. That the new PPS would need to keep a strong handle on the household was becoming increasingly clear. And the final revelation, shared by the good and the great committee in the spirit of making sure everybody knew what they were getting into, there was, his very distinguished chairman said, an informal power structure within the household where everyone from competing courtiers to kitchen cooks would be currying princely favor. Indeed, he said, despite all the official power and authority of the PPS, valets might, indeed, most likely would, get the last word. For who, after all, can compete with a man who tucks in the prince every night? Or, as we now know, with the valet who puts toothpaste on the royal toothbrush, just so. It was an extraordinary and somewhat surreal 2-hour interview. Next step, I was told, was for the two of us who were the remaining candidates, yes, dear audience, I had made it to the final two, to be called for an interview with their Royal Highnesses, the Prince of Wales and the Duchess of Cornwall, Charles and Camilla. I went out and celebrated with a glass of wine. The following day, I boarded my return flight back to DC in a state of increased and increasing agitation. My pleasure in having an interview story I could dine out on, actually, this is the first time I've ever told it in any detail, my pleasure was dimmed by an increasing sense that this might not actually be a job I wanted. Of one thing I was sure, good manners, thank you, Mother, and indeed self-preservation demanded that if I were going to pull out, I needed to do it before meeting Charles and Camilla. Impossibly bad form to do it afterwards. I spent the 8-hour trip going backwards and forwards in my mind. Kensington Palace was a definite draw, but living cheek by jowl in a royal apartment block would mean we were never able to relax. And how would our dog interact with the royal dogs? Embarrassing for sure. My wonderful husband got on with everyone, but his concern about new suits, and by now he'd moved on to new furniture, was magnified by my own. Would I have to go out and buy green wellies, hunting and shooting garb? Oh my God, sensible tweed skirts. Would I have to ride to hounds? My allegiance had always been with the fox. Reconnect with my English accent. The good and the great held out the carrot that Charles was taking on more and more of his mother's work, that at some point soon, this job would morph into PPS to the king. That was certainly alluring, but there was no guarantee. And recall, this was 2011, and Charles was not crowned king till 2023. Palace math was a little off. But my mind kept coming back to all that pomp and circumstance, all that yes, sir, no, sir, 3 bags full, sir. All that bowing and scraping, all that privilege and patronage, all that dysfunctional household stuff, and having to master one's strength day after day after day to speak truth to power and not to become just another yes man or yes woman, as so many did. Could I, who had railed against all that tradition and class and hierarchy, actually become a courtier? Just the thought of it was exhausting. I had simply been in America too long. On Monday morning, I rang the headhunter to withdraw my name. 8 years later, by a strange twist of fate, I went to work with Charles on an environment project. With him, not for him. An important distinction and one that one savvy insider had advised me in 2011 was the only possible working relationship that was sustainable without losing one's mind. It was heady stuff. We met and dined at his royal residence in Clarence House. I visited him at Birkhall and Dumfries House, his houses in Scotland. We flew together on a small 10-seater to Davos for a speech he would give. My wearing trousers, yes, but which as a non-staffer was quite allowed. His ready to be changed into Prince of Wales check double-vented suit hanging up in the tiny aircraft lavatory, not toilet. On one side of me, his valet polishing the royal shoes. On my other side, his body man who keeps him safe. And across from me, sitting next to Charles in pride of place, as was wholly appropriate, his PPS. Do I regret that I pulled out in 2011? Rarely. Mostly, I think of my mother and that chair. How battle lines over the royals were drawn early. How it wasn't surprising I ended up taking the oath to become a proud American. How somehow I knew that palace courtier, indeed any kind of courtier, just wasn't me. And to celebrate that young, idealistic, iconoclastic, let's overturn the world and make it a fairer and more inclusive place. To celebrate that teenager and to make my father smile at the memory, wherever he may be, let me end by simply saying, with and without the royals, it's been a right royal life, isn't it? And I've loved every blooming minute of it, haven't I? And I wouldn't change a thing, not one thing. Thank you.
Wednesday, April 23rd, 2014, started as a typical beautiful spring day on our farm near Slate Mills. A mug of coffee, an English muffin, and checking email to see what business-related issues had arisen overnight and needed attention. Then I grabbed some tools and went to the Child Care and Learning Center to install child-proof latches on the playground gates to replace the ninja-like bungee cord traps that were too strong for the kids to defeat, but often snapped back into teachers' hands. Mission accomplished. I went home for lunch, never expecting I would end the day at the University of Virginia Hospital, missing most of my left leg. At lunchtime, my wife, Mary, called from Culpeper to say she had a flat tire on her Subaru Outback and was unsure about keeping her dinner date with Renata, a former neighbor who had moved to Dogwood Village in Orange. The Firestone dealer was more than happy to sell her a full set of new tires. But my frugality spoke up. There's more miles left on that set. Have them put on the spare. Reschedule with Renata and try to be home before dark. I'll deal with your flat tomorrow. After lunch, I plan to finish one of my annual farm chores, mowing broom sedge and other grass and weeds in our 7-acre Christmas tree field. Our old blue bush hog, bought years earlier, was already attached to an equally old Kubota tractor, co-owned with our next door neighbors. It had plenty of fuel and was ready to finish bush hogging the last acre of the field that I had mowed for more than 3 decades. I was on task to finish well before dark. I had listened to more than half of Siddhartha, Hermann Hesse's best-known novel, on my MP3 player, the narrator's voice coming into small speakers in my hearing protectors. And I had a fresh AAA battery in my pocket. If needed, I could quickly change the battery and keep mowing and not waste time driving back and forth to the house. By 4:30, the sun was beginning to set over Old Rag. The air was getting cooler, and I had only a few more rows to mow. I confirmed with Janet, our other neighbor, that she'd like me to bush hog around her garden at the west end of the field. I have no memory of how I was thrown from the tractor. The first thing I remember is sitting on the ground near the garden, thinking that I had jumped off the tractor and landed so close to it that my left foot had been caught under a rear tire. I momentarily felt a huge sense of relief, thinking that I had dodged a bullet, and relieved that my only injury seemed to be a tire rolling over my foot. That's because a bush hog is inherently very dangerous. It transfers the tractor's power to a heavy spinning disc that acts as a flywheel. That disc holds 2 thick steel blades whose ends move at over 100 miles an hour, capable of cutting down 1-inch saplings, for example, invasive autumn olives. At first, I didn't realize I had probably been bucked off the tractor by hitting a stump or something, and then blacked out from the pain. No doubt I got a huge spike of adrenaline that masked the pain and erased the impact from my memory. But then I looked down and realized instantly that life as I had lived it for 65 and a half years would henceforth be different. My left leg was shattered. I was staring at the head of my fibula. With Siddhartha still playing in my ears and the sun beginning to set over Old Rag, I somehow knew that I faced an existential choice. Either decide that I had had a full enough life, enjoy the sunset, it was lovely, hear the end of Siddhartha, and bleed out. Or act on my Eagle Scout training, fashion a tourniquet, get to the hospital as soon as possible, and not abandon Mary, our sons, our extended family and friends, or especially our grandchildren. I envisioned my mother dancing joyfully at several of her grandchildren's weddings and wanted to do the same myself, at least once. It took only a few seconds to choose life. Well, time to execute. I took off my leather belt and tried to tie it very tightly around my thigh, but the old belt leather was dry and broke in the middle. Well, that sucks. But I'm not giving up. I put the tongue back in the buckle to form a loop and then tied the broken ends together as tightly as I dared. I began yelling at the top of my lungs to get attention and assistance. Fortunately, Mary had indeed canceled her dinner with Renata and come home to take a walk before dark. Fortunately, she heard me yelling and drove down the hill to see what was going on. She found me sitting on the ground, trying to butt scooch my way backward towards Janet's car. Knowing that it had an automatic transmission, I planned to pull myself in and drive to the Culpeper if the keys were there. But seeing Mary and not realizing she had driven down the hill, I asked her to see if the keys were in the car. Realizing my intent and the extent of my injuries, she said her car was there. Things accelerated rapidly. I asked Mary to fetch Janet, for one of them to call 911, and to tell the rescue squad or ambulance to meet us at the Boston store to save time, to grab some rope or a garden hose to apply a second tourniquet. All of that accomplished, Mary and Janet somehow lifted me into the cargo area of the back of Mary's Outback, and the three of us sped to the Boston store, expecting our destination to be the Culpeper Hospital and the care of our surgeon friend, Ben Allen. The Sperryville Volunteer Rescue Squad met us at Boston. What a relief to see three familiar neighborly faces, Harold Bebout, Brian Ross, and Judy Reitinger. They immediately fitted a proper field tourniquet and reported by radio that my injuries were more than severe lacerations. And a medevac helicopter was quickly dispatched from Fredericksburg. The nearest landing zone was only a few miles away at Salem Rescue Squad on Route 522. The closest trauma center is UVA Hospital in Charlottesville, and Pegasus, flying faster than a crow, but on the same path, landed on the hospital roof, about at dusk, barely an hour after the accident. In the OR, the trauma center cleaned what was left of my leg, transfused a unit of blood, and assessed what surgery would follow. Meanwhile, other communications and logistics were occurring in parallel. Mary began calling our immediate family, plus friends and neighbors. And an entourage set course for Charlottesville. Both of our sons were inbound immediately. Coincidentally, my mother, then 92, already had plane tickets, but from St. Louis to Durham on Southwest, to meet her third great-grandchild, just about to be 6 months. She changed course for Richmond instead. Friends dropped everything to help Mary. Harold and Mary Fran drove her to UVA. My college roommate and his wife, who lived just 2 miles from the hospital, opened their home to everyone. As word spread to friends of friends, I learned to be cautious when explaining my accident to people who are unfamiliar with farm equipment. An acquaintance from San Francisco, informed of my injury by a mutual friend in Madison, initially thought that a bush hog was some kind of wild boar. And then I'd been mauled by a rogue giant that gnawed off half my leg. Surgeons decided to operate the very next day, in fact. If all went well, their goal was to achieve a definitive result, to remove the cracked portion of my femur, tend to all the veins, arteries, nerves, muscles, and sew me up. We were very heartened to learn that our friend Kathy, an OR nurse, had signed on to the surgical team that day. And fortunately, all went fine, and I emerged with a stump that would be ready for a prosthetic leg about 4 months later. But first, I had several days of recovery at UVA Hospital, followed by a week at the rehab clinic. Thanks to my every other day rowing machine regimen, plus regular work on our farms, I was in far better shape than most new amputees. While I was in rehab, friends and neighbors modified our first floor bathrooms to be wheelchair accessible and built a grade level bridge to our back door. I was also given a few new belts. But there are better and easier ways to upgrade your wardrobe. Kind friends were ready to trade in a Toyota sedan with automatic transmission, but handed it on to us instead. A huge help because both our cars were stick shift. And although I was on crutches the first 4 months, I could drive myself to physical therapy and other appointments. Finally, in mid-July, I got my first prosthetic leg, and my PT segued into learning how to walk in it. Knowing of our devotion to our 2-mile Bluebird Trail with 32 nesting boxes, friends scoured the East Coast for a used Kawasaki mule in good condition so that I could continue to monitor those boxes, tend to our forest trails, and harvest firewood. The old tractor, also a stick shift, had to go, and we upgraded to a tractor with hydrostatic drive, plus a new zero-turn lawnmower for the yards. And unlike our old tractor, both of these have seat belts. Fast forward a decade through about 20 prosthetic sockets that have been fitted over the years as my stump has diminished, and I'm still mowing the lawns. And although I do use the tractor from time to time, someone else bush hogs the fields, not me. What more does the future hold for any of us? For me, taking the time to smell the roses includes going to soccer games. How ironic that my favorite sport is unique in having a feature known as added time. It's also called extra time, stoppage time, and injury time. At the end of the game's nominal 90 minutes, the officials added additional playing time to compensate for delays such as substitutions, disputes, or injuries. The amount of added time is not shown on the big scoreboard, but kept by the head referee on the field. So I am literally playing on in injury time, aware that the ref's final whistle is but a breath away.
Wasn't that terrific? Let's give them another round of applause. Great stories. Before we go to the talk back, there are a couple people I just wanted to also acknowledge. When Sally started off her comments, she said NOP had been around for 27 years. There's two people here I want to mention that are key to the fact that it's been around for 27 years. So let's just thank Sally Morgan for the great job she's done. And there's also a young lady toward the back there, if she might stand up. Joyce Abel. Let's give Joyce a big round of applause. Joyce, I said to stand up. Oh. Now, Joyce and I work together a lot. She knows I mean that out of love. All right. So I'm going to start with a very general question just to get things warmed up, and then we'll turn it over to the audience, and Ed will go around and pass the microphone. But I'd just like each of the storytellers to share with the audience what the experience was like to be an NOP storyteller. Let's just start with something that simple. Tell us what the whole experience was like and what you liked about it the most. You want to start at that end?
Well, there's a favorite word I have, and it's cathartic. And I think this experience was cathartic. And the process is quite amazing. I remember Barbara Sharp met me at the Flatwood Mall. We just ran into each other, and she said, you know, I think Dick and Sally would like to get in touch with you about sharing a story for NOP. And I said, well, I kind of thought NOP was about people with extraordinary accomplishments. And she said, Chris, honey, it's about stories, and we all have stories. And so I met with Dick at Before and After, and he interviewed me very deftly, and I kind of gave him my resume, if you will. And he's like, Chris, tell me a little bit about yourself. And I started to talk. And at one point in my sharing, he said, oh, honey, you've got a story. And that's where it went from there, and it's been quite extraordinary.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, extraordinary is a wonderful word. In my experience, I was actually on a panel a year or so ago with Bill Deedle about being widowed. And Lynn and Ed Dolnick were in the audience, and they came up to me afterwards, later, and said, oh, I think you might want to do No Ordinary Person. And I said, I don't think I can talk about this for 20 minutes. So we went through possible other stories, and it was really wonderful. It was wonderful to work with them. Ed was a really great editor. He would make suggestions, say more colors, more color, more examples, more description. And what I loved about it, in the process of doing this, stories and memories started to come back. So the story about the Simpsons in the Strand was one it came back, and I rang up my brother in Scotland, and I said, do you remember this lunchtime at Simpson? He said, do I remember? It was awful. And our father was so angry. So it was just a wonderful process, and I would really encourage others to do it.
It took me a while before I was 10 years, before I felt ready to tell my story. And I was blessed to have Sally as my coach. And thank her and the other coaches for their work in helping us develop our stories into something we felt comfortable enough to tell to you on stage.
Took you 10 years, took me 60. But it's been a great pleasure to hark back to memories from that period of my life, which was a very important period. And along with that, one of the great pleasures of this exercise has been working with my wonderful granddaughter. Great.
Okay, so questions from the audience. Ed will be the Vanna White here.
Who has the question?
But I have a stage voice too. And I'm going to ask this question of my ma, curiously enough, because I should know all the answers there, but I don't. So I'm going to ask you, Ma, because you didn't tell us as you were descending the mountain in that final, very critical moment, and the dusk was coming down, and you have these two awesome figures in front of you with their guns and everything. What your last thoughts were going through your mind as you approached that moment there?
Oh, I was scared to death. So that
Who has the question?
I didn't know what was going to happen. And it was all good.
Chris, I was wondering, what city in Massachusetts did you end up in? Woburn?
In Woburn,
Oh,
Woburn,
which is near.
pronounced Woburn, near Burlington and Winchester,
Okay, thank you.
on the North Shore.
Sorry, there's a question in the back.
We set up something called the Sustainable Markets Initiative, and he went to launch it at the Davos meeting in Switzerland, the annual meeting, and I worked on the speech for him. It was a fun experience, but it was very different from actually working for him full time. It was nice to be able to go home at the end of the day.
Carolyn, I'm wondering how you resisted tilting your chair back in Buckingham Palace.
Well, that's a very good question. And I think I was really on my best behavior. And so, but if I'd taken the job, there would have been chair tilting, for sure.
I'm curious, excuse me, Jane, is there a life lesson or two that you take or took from that experience that you've kind of kept with you as you progress through life? Any kind of reflections or what you might have taken away from that?
Perhaps that you don't know how something's going to turn out, and sometimes it turns out very well. And furthermore, that the way a person is dressed or their headgear and what is not the explanation of what kind of person they are.
Barney, I wonder if you, at this point now, 10 years later, have an idea that things converged for a reason, that Mary had a flat tire and came back, that you had a belt that you could actually tie on, if all those things were kind of preordained for you to help make your choice to live?
Yeah, in retrospect, it's an amazing series of coincidences. And it's really a sign of how community, and this community, as all of you know, is so special, comes together somehow, some way, often for the best, hopefully for the best. I have thought about what would have happened if she hadn't come home. I'm not sure. I might have been able to hear the end of Siddhartha right then rather than having to wait a bit. So community is one of the reasons I'm so happy to have done this, because part of a community is what we share with each other, including our stories. And so, again, I put in a plug for screwing up the courage, if you will, to do this if you have any inclination for it.
I also have a question for Barney. I'm just having a husband who drives the tractor a lot. What do you recommend to all of us to remain safe in our regular tractor driving lives?
Well, one alternative is to hire someone else to do it for you. And obviously, he's much younger, so it is somewhat age-related, but also wear a seatbelt.
All right, well, I would just like to echo what Barney said. We really do encourage everyone to participate. There is no such thing as everyone is a no ordinary person. Everyone has a story, and I think the process is super interesting for both the coach and the storyteller, and they were terrific stories. So how about one last big round of applause for these?
Thank you.